In Star Trek, there has been a little more than a single instance of officers that have been suffering from mental health issues. One of the most popular of those officers amongst the fans is Lieutenant Reg Broccoli. Sorry, I mean Barclay. Though, while being in a relatively low ranking position, it isn't unheard of that an officer might be struggling with a certain health condition, such as anxiety, even to the extreme that Reg did. The reason that I bring this up is that I wanted to address the reality of an officer with mental health issues being put in the captain's seat of a military starship. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this. Please do leave them in the comments, but for now, here's my take on if Captain Shaw should have been given the command of the Titan. So before I get into this, and there's a tsunami of comments from actual military officers and veterans, I just wanted to let you know that I don't have any actual military experience. This video is just based on my observations of Captain Shaw and my own logic. If you do, however, agree or disagree with anything that I say in this video, I'm happy to discuss in the comments, but please keep it respectful. That said, let's get on with it, shall we? So from what I've seen on Picard Season 3, Captain Shaw is pretty much a by the book, keep his head down, and let's just get on with it type of commander. He seems extremely capable of keeping the ship running on the day-to-day basis and manages his crew quite well. That said, he doesn't suffer any falls, and he has a quick wit about him, which is actually quite enjoyable. He might come off as a bit of a dipshit, his own words, but it's the kind of guy that you can just go out, have a few beers and watch the game with. He might have his biases, and believe me, I'll get to that shortly, but all in all, he is a capable commander. Wouldn't you agree? So to run a ship on a normal day in peacetime, you'd have no problem in putting him in the captain's seat, would you? Now, let's dig a little deeper. It's known to Starfleet that Shaw had a traumatic experience due to the Borg and the Battle of Wolf 359. He lost his friends and crewmates to be honest, dumb luck. He was, I think, handpicked by a superior officer to board an escape pod, leaving everyone else behind to die. This kind of stuff would leave scars on anyone. Now, let's assume that he had mandatory therapy sessions, or at least for a while. We know that it wasn't really that long for Picard when he was assimilated by the Borg. So I guess the fact that you're in Starfleet and have gone through the rigorous training, being forced to face your greatest fears in order to overcome them, and even face death itself in the Kobayashi Maru, all of this points to that having graduated the academy, you should be able to handle a great number of stressful and even traumatic situations. So even if you are pushed to the extreme, the idea is that you shouldn't take too long to get back on your feet. I'm assuming that's what Starfleet thinks. At least that's the general idea that I'm being fed as the viewer. Does everyone agree with that? Okay, so let's just say that Shaw went through all of this training before he was posted on the doomed ship. He's gone through the PTSD therapy or the equivalent in the 24th century, but it's never been put in a situation where he's ever had to face the Borg again. As far as I know, he never mentioned if he took part of the Battle of Sector 001, you know, the one in First Contact. So I think it's safe to assume that he didn't. At the very least, Starfleet tried to keep Picard away, so I don't think they'd really batter an eyelid in making it so that Shaw wouldn't have had to relive his past. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but it's possible. Or who knows, it could have been the case that he was posted too far away from the battle to even take part of it. Either way, he never mentioned it, as far as I remember. With that said, he would have been involved in the Dominion War. The only thing I'd have to say about that is that it was, despite being a greater enemy, it was a different type of conflict, and there would have been time to come to terms with the situation. As much as it is still war and a massive conflict, and full of horrors, I feel that it would have been more of a slow burner and more of a prolonged stress than an immediate shock of, you know, the galaxy coming to an end if they don't deal with the situation right there and then. I hope that makes sense. The threat of death is still there, but with the Borg, there's no time to really process what's happening until after the fact. The reason I bring up the Dominion War is that there didn't seem to be as much of a reaction from Shaw to Vadic as there was to Picard. Yes, they were in a hostage situation, but you didn't get much of a sense of disgust from him, even when they were face to face. It seemed to be more of the case where he was more concerned of not doing anything to make the situation worse than what it was. Compare this to a non-stressful and controlled first meeting with Picard. His reaction and demeanor were completely different. And I think one of the reasons is that Shaw hasn't had to deal with the Borg, so he hasn't really had the chance to face his demons until now. So when he meets Picard, he has all of this pent up rage that comes out in a form of sarcasm. Don't get me wrong, bloody great sarcasm, but sarcasm nonetheless. And this is without taking into account the bigger picture, that being Picard's side of the experience. Being captain, Shaw would have access to the files that Picard would have given in his experiences, just like Janeway would have. This is where Picard was kidnapped and wasn't in control of his actions, and the journey to recovery that he himself, we find out later, that is still on. Where's his greatest sensibility now? Not only did he lash out at Picard in his own way, but he did it with other officers present, one of them being his own first officer, who did much more and for much longer as a former Borg. Also, in doing so, he disrespected a superior officer, retired or not, and that really could have resulted in a court-martial. Imagine if he did that to Admiral Jellicoe. To be fair, I would have paid good money to see that. Now, let's get to 7. I'm going to be generous and say it's not all Shaw here. 7 should have never been put in that situation in the first place, where she's the first officer of someone who's had previous with the Borg, even if Starfleet didn't know about his bias. Also, having the knowledge of assimilated Starfleet captains doesn't mean that she's got any actual experience in a command position. She was not ready. That said, there should still have been things that she could do. For example, report Shaw to the chief medical officer or even Starfleet themselves, stating that his judgment is compromised, at least when it comes to her, which in turn would at least lead to an investigation or possible transfer of one or both of them. I'm not really versed in these kind of procedures, at least in the military, but there's got to be some kind of safeguarding procedure for the treatment of officers. Anyway, the point is that the situation of Shaw's treatment of 7 could have either easily been avoided or have never been given the chance to be a thing in the first place. However, Shaw isn't completely innocent in this. Again, if I were to be generous, I'd say maybe he's teasing 7 to build her character. But even after the Sydney changeling scene, he still does it after 7 tells Shaw it's a sign of respect by calling her by a chosen name. There's actually a term that the trans community uses for this kind of treatment. It's called dead naming, using the name of the previous selves as a way to dismiss the person that they are now, thus using their dead name. This is one of the biggest insults for a trans person, and the same thing is happening here. He is basically ignoring the person that 7 is ever since that she was rescued by Voyager. I don't know about you, but that's a massive slap in the face. So, having put in 7 through this for a year, by the way, there is the question of, does he actually have a first officer that he can count on? And by extension, because the first officer is usually closer to the crew, can he count on the crew under his command in a crisis? Especially in situations where he needs them to trust him on his judgment in a situation that doesn't necessarily make sense. I'm of course referencing the speech that Captain Picard had to give to the crew in the past timeline in All Good Things, when he was trying to convince them to set course into the anomaly. I know this is an extreme circumstance, but really, in space or in the battlefield or anything where it's really adverse, you need to trust the crew that's under you. So I ask again, should Captain Shaw been put in a situation where he's dealing with former Borg without at least a superior officer or medical professional having a conversation with him about this first? And 7 should have had someone speak to her too, to see if they are both good to go. I do get in Starfleet that you do go where you're sent, but at the same time, you don't want to create a volatile situation when it's just not necessary. Now, that said, through all of this, Captain Shaw isn't an unreasonable man. When it's revealed that Jack Crusher is Picard's son, he doesn't like it, but it's not going to make a father hand his son over to the enemy, regardless of the circumstances or how he feels about the people. He does eventually face off with Picard in a holodeck. Again, probably not best to do it in public, but at least he's able to get it out, which is a therapy in itself. And when Picard comes back to him about it later, calling him a dipshit, there's a certain level of respect, and at least now they can work together. Now, with 7, dead naming aside, he does help her to deal with the changeling threat in a way that makes her relate to him. Basically, both of them agreeing that he's an arsehole. And to be honest, if you didn't have a tear in your eye when Tuvok shown the holo recording to 7, I just don't think we can be friends. So now I'm interested to know your thoughts. Should Shaw have been made captain? Should Starfleet take more care on who they assign together? Is he really just a dipshit from Chicago? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more like this. Oh, and one last thing. Would you like mayo with that?